Survivors of plane crashes, boat sinks or something catastrophic of this magnitude, what's your story? So when I was a very young child, I lived in Southeast Asia. One day early in the morning I was just playing. My parents must have been doing their morning prayers and the next thing I knew the entirety of the ocean was spilling over itself. We lived on the coast at this time, and it was like the whole ocean had just lifted out. My dad grabbed me and ran towards a block of apartments at the end of the street. I don't know what happened to my mum, but she must have been unable to run fast enough, because I'm pretty sure she got overwhelmed by the tide and survived by holding onto a tree. I'm not entirely sure how she survived actually, because looking back on the extent of the 2004 tsunami she should have been swept away completely by the force of the water. So now I'm on the top of this roof and my dad goes back in, swimming to our house, to retrieve our passports and documents, while the water keeps creeping up. I think it was a 4 or 5 story building, and the water must have reached the 2nd or 3rd floor. He must have been a really strong swimmer, because he got pretty much all of our documents in between the waves, and probably saved my mum as well. After this we were able to stay with friends some distance away after this, but everything in the town got destroyed. In fact, I realized the reason why my parents don't bring up my childhood friends or try to keep in contact with their families is because they are dead. This is pretty much the only really vivid memory I have from that age, and my parents still kind of had a fear of the sea for a long time after that. They still can't handle videos of flooding. Here's a question I can honestly answer. I survived an airplane crash. The story: my mother owned a few aircraft and hangar at our small town's airport. I spent a lot of time at the airport as I was growing up, spending summer washing airplanes, sweeping out hangars, etc. One warm summer afternoon in the mid-1980s we planned to take a short flight in her Piper J3 Cub. This plane was built in the mid-1940s and had an aluminum skeleton covered in fabric and tandem seats, one in front, one in back. I sat in front due to the better view and my mom, the pilot, sat in back. I remember the pre-flight and some taxiing to the runway, but nothing else. Now the rest of the story I received secondhand. Neither my mom nor I remember anything of the actual accident due to the massive head trauma we both received. But what I've heard from family and the ambulance drivers who arrived on the scene is that on takeoff, the most dangerous part of any flight, IMHO, we lost power. Engine cut out, not really sure why. So with a relatively slow airspeed and no thrust from the engine we changed from being a beautiful flying machine to a brick rather quickly. Well, we dropped like a brick and proceeded to hit the ground in a rather quick manner. The ambulance drivers who arrived on the scene thought we were done for. Things did not look good for us. But after a helicopter ride to the nearest trauma center 100 miles away, we are still alive and breathing today. I spent about 5 weeks in the hospital, but only remember the last 2. To remind me what happened, I have nasty scars on my lower lip and chin and a dent on the side of head. One thing I find myself wondering is if I had the chance to relive the whole thing over again, would I want to remember? At this point in my life I can say I would not. Such things are not worth remembering. And did we ever fly again? You bet. As soon as my mom was able to pass a flight physical we were both up in the air again. I was pilot in command of a small Cessna, taking my dad out for his first sightseeing ride on an October evening. He'd taken the back seat in one of my training sessions before, but this time was the first time the two of us were alone together and at liberty to go as we pleased. After a while, I noticed that the engine had lost 300 RPM. I pushed the throttle to maximum, no change. Turned on the carb heat, if I remember correctly. Nope, still nothing. I began heading back to the airport, but as the power slowly diminished, I knew we wouldn't make it back by a long shot. Conclusion: I had to get that bad down somewhere. It was nighttime. Beneath me were patches of fields or forest, and I couldn't tell which was which in the evening darkness. I opted for the only well-lit place in the circumstances, the freeway. I made my emergency call, got a response, told my dad what I was about to do, and proceeded to fly the airplane. By the time I was on my so-called final approach, the engine was puttering along at a measly 1000 RPM despite a full open throttle. All I had to do was to follow a slight bend in the freeway to the left, just past a viaduct, and I'd have 3 open lanes of road on which to land, and probably surprise a few drivers along the way. Huge black bars suddenly showed up in my field of vision, followed by bright white flashes of light. The aircraft had just struck high voltage power lines. By the time I was done screaming, the aircraft had rolled down in a side ditch and slammed itself against a fence. Ambulances arrived within a minute, pulled my dad and I out, and raced us to the hospital. I awoke in a dimly lit hospital room, dimly lit because of the city-wide power failure I'd just caused, which I realized once all the other lights turned on late at night and the nurses cheered at getting power back. Somehow, I didn't break anything, though I had a sore and stiff body for a few weeks, and my back became prone to locking for the next several years. My father had a few broken bones, but was judged stable and set to recover. However, he suddenly and unexpectedly succumbed to his wounds a week later. I haven't piloted an aircraft since, and have no desire to. I can be a passenger in an airliner or a commercial small aircraft without a problem, but my days of flying are over. I was in a plane crash in 2013, 3 friends, and I had taken a Cessna to Interior BC for the long weekend. One friend had their private pilot's license. The day we were heading home it was quite hot, and the plane was, according to investigators, overloaded and overfueled for the heat/altitude. Once we reached 2,000 feet above Tekiath we began losing airspeed. The pilot panicked and did some steep turns in an attempt to gain some speed, but it scrubbed nearly all our altitude pretty much instantly. Now at a few hundred feet and descending rapidly the pilot took aim at a farmer's field. They managed to level out at around tree height, but we were quickly running out of field. Maybe 100 or so meters before the end of the field they dropped the plane to the ground, the nose dug in, and we flipped end for end. I ended up walking away essentially unscathed, minor bruising from the seat belt and some small scratches. The pilot had a pretty good cut and bashed their knee up on the dashboard. The front passenger, my GF, took pretty much the brunt of it all. Her seat ripped off the floor, smashing her against the roof. It shredded the ligaments in one side of her neck, compressed her spine, and concussed her badly. The ligaments were bad and are still causing issues now 5 years later. But the post-concussion issues were far worse. Watching someone you love lose the ability to read, remember what they had for breakfast, or whether or not they had breakfast, maintain any semblance of emotional stability, or even do something like play a board game to pass the time. Learning and remembering rules was too stressful, was the worst thing I have ever experienced. It took a solid 2 years before things started returning to what I could call normal. I'm sure it'll come back and edit/add to this post, but I've got to get back to work. TLDR, here's a pic of the plane. When I was 19 my buddy and I went fishing. It's a pretty big lake up in Gainesville, Florida. I was sitting at the very front with the cooler to try to balance out the weight, and while we were crossing the middle of the lake in Arguino we had a paddle strapped to the side, and it caught the water. While we were going about 20 miles per hour, it threw us probably 7 to 10 feet and immediately started sinking. About 5 minutes before that happened we decided to put both of our phones in a waterproof box, which ultimately saved us. BC there was no one else out that day, given it was a little chilly outside. So after we were in the water the boat started sinking fast, but my friend and I stayed calm and started brainstorming on what we should do. First thing I did was swim down to the boat and by feel had to find the phones. Once that happened we called the police, but their response time was awful. We were treading in water that was cold enough to give us hypothermia, with the box that had our phones in it over our heads for about 50 minutes until the dispatch lady said they were commandeering someone else's boat because theirs wasn't starting. Once we got out the officers told us that they were expecting to find us dead either from getting stuck on the mushy bottom and drowning or by some of the big gators, but luckily we didn't encounter any of them. After the ambulance took our temperature and we came back fine, they proceeded to make sure we were okay, then let us get on with our day. Life and death situations are no joke and they can happen at any time. Make sure you are prepared mentally and physically. Your life or your friends may depend on you and how you've trained. Survived the Isla Vista shooting of 2014. I still get jumpy when I hear fireworks or other loud noises. My immediate response is almost always to scramble under the nearest table. PTSD is a bitch.